sure that you're aware, Complete College America is going to be releasing soon one of our signature reports. This is going to be another report in a series on co-requisite support and the impact that it has. So for those of you who've been following us, you know that this started off almost a decade ago with Bridge to Nowhere. That was followed by Spanning the Divide. And stay tuned, in the next few weeks, you're going to see another groundbreaking signature report coming from Complete College America on co-requisite support. Some of the key takeaways, since we know you're interested, you're on this webinar, we're going to give you a little bit of information as a teaser, which is we know co-requisite works. We have the data. What once was an idea has been proven. And we know it's an equity strategy, as we've seen institutions and states essentially eliminate institutional performance gaps or differences across different groups, demographic groups of students. Some of the questions that came out really early with co-requisite support is, how does this fit with finances for institutions as well as for students? And we know it's a win-win for both students as well as for the colleges and universities. And all this comes together in one simple point. Co-requisite should be the norm. This is settled law. This is the way forward for colleges and universities. You're going to hear all about that today. We're going to drop a one-pager in the chat where you can learn more about this upcoming report as well. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Brandon Protis. I am a strategy director here at Complete College America. And I am truly thrilled to introduce Dr. Katie Hearn. She is one of the absolute leaders when it comes to co-requisite support, and is one of the most provocative thinkers out there. So as a professor of English at Skyline College, Dr. Katie Hearn teaches co-requisite and standard sections of English composition. She is also co-founder and executive director of the California Acceleration Project, or CAP. So founded in 2010, CAP supports the state's 116 community colleges to use high school grades for placement, replace standalone remedial courses with co-requisite models, implement math pathways, and teach with high challenge, high support pedagogy. CAP was instrumental in the passage of AB 705. It's a law in California that requires community colleges to rely primarily on high school grades for placement and establishes transferable college-level English and math courses as the default starting placement for students. Dr. Hearn has published more than 25 articles, book chapters, and reports focused on reforming placement, remediation structures, and pedagogy. In 2016, the Washington Monthly named her and CAP co-founder Myra Snell to their list of the 16 most innovative people in higher education. I will also say that Dr. Katie Hearn is a close colleague, companion, and friend to Complete College America, and we're really thrilled to have her present today. You're in for a real treat, and I will be dropping some of CAP's most recent reports into the chat once she gets started. So with that, Katie, we'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Brandon. I'm really happy to be here with all of you today, and thank you for showing up for the webinar. I'm going to be sharing with you some of the really dramatic changes we've been making in the California community college system in the last few years. And I'm going to do it in slightly different order than might be typical. I think often when we talk about co-requisite support, we focus a lot on the specifics of the model and how is it designed. And I'm going to actually hold off on talking about any of that kind of detail about co-rec support until toward the end of my presentation. And instead, I want to focus on what is it that makes co-recs so uniformly powerful and where the results are just always so much better than standalone developmental courses, because that's really at the heart of what we're doing in California. Before we do that, I want to do a couple of polls just to get a sense of who's in the room and what your system is like around these issues. So if you could all answer those 2 poll questions, and then we'll share the results. Melanie, are we Can we show the poll results as they're coming in? Okay. So we have the largest group is the faculty, 34%, college administrator, 30%, counselor advisor, 10, system official, there's one legislative person, welcome, and then some other folks. And then the next question, what percentage of your incoming students enroll in a standalone developmental course in English and math? So 30 of you said 0 to 24%. That's good. That's the largest number. The next largest group is still 25 to 49%. And then a lot of you are not sure. Okay. So thank you. That gives me a sense of where we're starting from. This is the agenda for today. I'm going to start by giving you an introduction to the reforms that we've undertaken in California and the first year results from those. And then I'm going to pause and do a little Q&A, and Brandon's going to be monitoring the questions and giving them to me. And then I'm going to talk about the impact we've seen on racial equity. And then I'll get into some of the details about what are the co-requisite models in California and what are we seeing in terms of results of those. And then another question break and some further resources. So the first thing I want to do is give you some examples of students that really were part of the motivation behind the reforms we've undertaken in California. And the specific reforms I'm going to focus on are, the first is using high school grades for placement instead of standardized placement tests. So here is Andres Salazar. When he took the AccuPlacer test at his college, which is College of the Canyons, he was placed into arithmetic, which meant 2 years of remedial courses in California. Based on that starting placement, his likelihood of completing a transferable gateway math course in 3 years was only 12%. And that was actually good compared to the statewide average, which was 6%. His goal was to achieve a bachelor's degree in music conducting. So he's on a non-math intensive pathway. He needs good quantitative reasoning skills, but he's not going to be building bridges. He's not going to be taking calculus. He's in a non-math intensive field. In high school, he earned an A in Algebra 2. He also had a 4.0 GPA. So you can see the disconnect between his high school performance, which is exceptional, and his placement on the standardized test, which was as low as it was possible to be placed into arithmetic. So his college was one of the early implementers of using high school grades for placement. And so based on his high school record, he was allowed to enroll directly in statistics, where he earned an A. And he completed his transferable math course in 1 term instead of 5. And then when we followed up with him in fall 2017, he had already transferred to the California Institute of the Arts to pursue his major. So that's one of the major reforms we have undertaken in California. And the other one is replacing standalone remedial courses with co-requisite models. And so a student who's a nice illustration of that is Caleb Rendon Guerrero at Cuyamaca College outside of San Diego. His background is a little different than Andres Salazar's. He was a high school dropout who'd been in and out of the criminal justice system. His goal was to be the solution, not the problem in his family, and create a nonprofit to help kids like him. He was placed via AccuPlacer into elementary algebra, which meant a year of remedial math courses before he could take the transferable course for his major, which was statistics. But because his college was one of the early implementers of co-requisite models in California, he was able to enroll directly in a section of college statistics that had an additional 2-unit linked co-requisite, where he got additional time with his instructor for guidance and review of sort of more foundational math concepts, collaborative activities. He earned a B in that course, and when we checked up with him later, he had maintained a GPA of 3.6, graduated and transferred to San Diego State University. So I want to step back from those examples and say, before AB 705, when there were just a few colleges piloting these models, what was the status quo in California? We had very restrictive placement policies. So fewer than 25% of incoming students would begin in transferable gateway math and English courses across California. We had racially inequitable placement policies. So data showed that Black and Latinx students were disproportionately excluded from transferable classes and required to take not even just one remedial class, but multiple remedial classes. And our statewide research showed that enrolling in remedial courses reduced student completion for every student group studied to date. They all had lower completion if they took even just one remedial English or math course than if they were just allowed to begin in a transferable course. So the metaphor here is look at how few students are on the Golden Gate Bridge. It's like very, very few people allowed to go into that gateway in California. But after AB 705, it was more like this. Virtually all students have a legal right to enroll directly in transferable gateway English and math courses after the law was passed in 2017. So just in broad strokes, what AB 705 did is we no longer use placement tests in English and math. High school grades are the primary means of placement, and that includes GPA as well as the math taken in high school. And students can self-report their high school grades. We don't require transcripts. We don't require complicated transcript sharing agreements or students to produce a transcript and us to verify it. We just ask them to report it and we believe them. One of the standards of the law is that, and this is the really radical standard, is that instead of placement being a sort of a prepared, unprepared switch, it's about placing students into courses where they have the greatest likelihood of completing transferable English and math within 1 year. So if putting a student into a remedial course makes them less likely to complete the transferable class in 1 year than if they just were allowed to enroll, then colleges are not allowed to require that they start in a remedial course. For the first time, community colleges were restricted from requiring remedial courses, but they weren't prevented from offering these courses, and that's where the weakness in our law, we're becoming aware of that as a pretty significant loophole in the law. And then just to know about California is we really value local control as a state. So we have very decentralized implementation, 116 colleges retaining local control over exactly what their placement policies are, whether or not they offer co-rec support or other support, the pedagogy, how many remedial classes they still offer. That's all locally controlled. So the first thing that I want to share is that based on this law, there was a really dramatic increase in students starting directly in transferable gateway courses. In English, it went from 44% before colleges began implementing these changes to 95% in fall 2019, which is the first semester of full implementation of AB 705. And in math, it went from 26% of students to 79% of students starting directly in a transferable gateway course. Now, a lot of these students are just taking standard transferable courses. They're not necessarily co-requisite students. 1 in 5 students statewide enrolled in a co-requisite support model. The rest were just allowed to begin directly in a regular transfer level course without support. And I think as a state, there was a lot of holding our breaths at this moment before the research from the first year came in, of a lot of people feeling like this was a really dramatic change and a lot of fear that students would flame out and that students would be harmed. This is a pretty radical transformation of how we were placing students. And so the good news is that after the first year of data, we can see how much better off students were by being able to begin directly in transfer level courses. So there were still 5% of students still did enroll in a standalone remedial course, one remedial course. If they did, only 25% would completed college English in the first year of AB 705 last year. But if they started directly in transfer level, which was 95% of them did, then 70% of students passed the course within 1 year. So you can see that just how much better off they were by being able to just proceed directly to go and start in the transfer level course. In math, if they started one remedial course below the transferable course, only 14% completed a transferable course in a year. But if they started in the transferable course, it was 60%. And again, this is not only co-requisite students. This was all students who were allowed to enroll directly in a transfer level course. Okay. The other thing that the research has looked at is, there's a lot of worry that certain students would be harmed. Would this be bad for low-income students? Would this be bad for students with disabilities? And so we've really, as a system, looked very closely at this. And the answer is, it's not bad for anybody. That every student group that has been examined to date has higher completion now than they did before these changes. So we have low high school GPA students, which is an English below a 1.9. Their completion has almost doubled. DSPS, which means students who are have registered disabilities and are receiving services for that, their completion went up over 20 points. EOPS is a low income student, foster youth, low income typically, and a lot of challenges. Veterans, Puente and Umoja are learning communities for Latinx and Black students. Every group is seeing substantial gains in completion of Gateway English composition. And the same is true in math. The low high school GPA, the disabled students, low income students, foster youth, all students are doing better by having this broader access to transfer level courses. So in terms of the key takeaways from sort of the big picture California reform, the first one is every student group examined has seen large completion gains from access to transferable gateway courses, and there's no evidence of students being harmed, even though there was a lot of fear that students would be harmed. Second is that gateway completion rates were 45 percentage points lower among students who took one remedial course than those who began in a gateway course. And this is followed over 1 year. And that most students didn't receive co-requisite support. They simply enrolled in a standard gateway course. And research hasn't been able to identify a group of students for whom starting in a remedial class leads to higher completion. And that's the standard of the law that we have to follow, is that whether we perceive them as ready or not, like as an English teacher, if I look at the first thing they write for me and I think, oh, wow, they're really not ready, that assessment is not what drives placement anymore. It's really about, we cannot put them into structures that lower their chances of completion. Okay, so here's the first pause for questions.
Great. Katie, one quick question was, you're talking completion rate within 1 year, correct?
Within 1 year, yeah.
Okay. So then we have a few other questions. I'll just tell you the topics and I can read them. One is about faculty buy-in. One is about math students who may not be going for degrees, but just upskilling or certificates. One is about placement for students who don't have high school grades if they didn't continue. And the other is about looking at data pre and post pandemic. Which one would you like to start with?
Okay. The first one, the faculty buy-in.
I can read you the whole question if you want.
Okay, yeah, let's start with
that. Okay, so, and that one's a pretty easy question, which is, how did you get faculty buy-in when it means changing the quote usual?
Yeah, I mean, in the California Acceleration Project, we spent the first 7 years of our existence mobilizing faculty to be leaders in this process and to make change locally. So it was all of the work on placement reform and co-requisites and accelerated remediation was voluntary for the first 7 years of CAP. And we recruited a really, really ferocious band of faculty champions who were really behind these changes. Some of them are in the room today. But we only, even after all of that work, we still only about 10% of students in the state were receiving any kind of accelerated remediation, and the rest were still trapped in the traditional remedial structures. And we sort of reached the limits of our ability to persuade people that we would give a whole presentation with a lot of data and student stories and space for people to ask questions. And then at the end, we'd have a group of, like, often math faculty, frankly, in the room just with their arms crossed and just saying, and like, people literally said to us, we're not doing that until somebody makes us. And so we just realized that our ability to really transform remediation in our system was hampered by if we were only using voluntary incremental mobilization. And so that was when we realized we needed to switch to policy, working directly on policy change and supporting legislation.
Great, thank you.
Uh,
Let me switch to one of the other questions. If a placement is largely based on high school courses and grades, how do you place students who didn't complete high school, international students, homeschooled students, those who do a GED, et cetera?
Yeah, great question. The for students who truly, like, you don't have to have finished high school. That the all the research in California that was looking at high school transcripts and using that to inform placement policies, that was based on 11th grade GPA anyway, and 11th grade course taking. So you don't need to have completed high school to be able to use high school grades for placement. You also don't need to have data sharing and validate it or prove it. But for students who really cannot be placed with high school grades, which is a relatively small percentage of students, then you can offer a guided placement process where you are enabling them to choose between a transfer level regular course, regular gateway course, or a gateway course with co-requisite support, and then that sort of resolves the problem.
Great, thank you. What are your thoughts about placing students in remedial math who are only seeking a certificate or upgrading skills? This is one of our college's arguments for keeping these classes. I think they mean the developmental education remedial sequences. And then a shout out to you. Keep up the great work. We appreciate it.
Thanks. I think that is a rationale that is really being offered to justify holding on to remedial structures that really don't serve any student. So for students who are in certificate programs, they can have specialized math that is tailored to their program. That's a pretty small, like, if a certificate program has a math requirement, they're often just plugging in a generic remedial math requirement. So it's not like, math for automotive or math for electricians or, and I would say that if a student is just seeking a degree, then it's a transferable gateway course is still a better choice for them. That you can offer. CSU is offering transferable quantitative reasoning credit for courses that are more about technical math or occupational math, or even just a liberal arts math course that is kind of more general quantitative reasoning. Those are generally much better fits for students, would much better serve them than a traditional remedial course.
Great. We have a few more questions coming in about some of the data, but I also want to make sure we're keeping an eye on the time.
Yeah.
So let me know if you want to continue with your presentation or if you want to take another question.
I think I probably should move on to the next part, but there's another Q&A section that we can fly back to these questions if we need to. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is the impact on racial equity in California community colleges. And just so that we all have this shared framework, that remedial courses put students at a structural disadvantage when starting college. So this person right here is starting at the starting line, whereas these two people are starting significantly back from the starting line. And that's what has been happening to, especially to Black and Latinx students in our system, is that they were much more likely to be concentrated by our placement practices into the lower remedial classes, where they might have 3 or even 4 classes, like 2 years of remedial courses before they could ever even get to the starting line. So of course that puts them at a structural disadvantage. I mean, once I sort of understood how this worked, I thought, wow, that's like just a really clear example of institutional racism, where we're using a test that does not measure their capacity to put them into a structure that puts them at a structural disadvantage to white students. So that's when we look at placement policies, I sort of think like we're really thinking about structural racism. That doesn't have to be intentional. It doesn't have to have been a conspiracy, but that was the effect on students. And so you can see that structural racism in English placement in the before. So for 2015, you can see that white students had more than twice the access to college composition compared to Black students, and almost twice as many as Latinx students. And Asian students were also at a disadvantage compared to white students. But after AB 705, it's virtually eliminated. I mean, the difference between 93 and 95 or 97% is fairly incidental. Those are statistically equivalent. So this one legislative change has largely eliminated that structural racism in English placement, and it has reduced it substantially in math, although not eliminated it completely. So you can see in math that Asian students had 3 times the access to transferable gateway math courses compared to Black students, and more than double that of Latinx students. And the groups are much closer together post AB 705 in California, but there's still a 12 percentage point difference between Asian students and African American students. So that's an area for ongoing attention in our system. So that's the placement side of things, but how about outcomes? Have the outcomes become more equitable? And so to answer this question, I'm going to point to some research done by the Public Policy Institute of California. They developed what they call a proportionality index, which basically compares how a group is represented among successful completions of a metric like transferable gateway courses compared to their presence in the population. So if Latino students represent 30% of first-time English or math students and 30% of gateway completions, then completion's equitable. So you sort of divide 30% by 30% and you get a score of 1.0. But if Latinos only represent 20% of completions, they're underrepresented because it would be 20% divided by 30% or 0.66. So this is a sort of just a way of measuring how equitably a group is represented in completions. And the guidelines are at equity is 1.0, near equity is 0.85 to 0.99, and below equity is 0.85 and below. So what you can see is that statewide in California, AB 705 has brought us closer to equitable representation for Black and Latinx students in gateway courses in both English and math. So all of the scores got closer to 1.0. But you can also see that we still have quite a ways to go, especially for Black students in math, that where further work is going to be needed to continue to produce equitable results for our Black and Latinx students, especially in math. And another way to look at equity is to compare completion rates across groups. And so what you can see in this graph is that each of the major groups that was studied has substantial gains. So this is a case where all boats rise. Every group is doing substantially better as a result of the changes we've made. But there are still gaps between groups, so white students have 76% English completion rate compared to 55% for Black students or 62% for Latinx students. And in math, the gaps are even greater between groups. So again, every group is doing better, is doing much better. So this idea that like we need to go back to the old way because we're concerned about inequities is a poorly informed argument, because every group is doing much better, but we still are seeing worrying gaps. So Asian students have twice the completion rate of Black students. So it's another place where we're not done with the work yet. We're gonna need to do more. So in terms of racial equity, I'd say the key takeaways to summarize is that AB 705 has nearly eliminated the structural racism of our prior placement policies. All racial and ethnic groups have higher completion with broader access, and Black and Latinx students are more equitably represented in completion of these courses. but racial equity gaps remain in completion, and further work will be needed to address other drivers of inequity, such as student basic needs, sort of food and housing insecurity issues or insufficient financial aid policies, implicit bias in which students colleges continue to enroll in remedial math. We're seeing that Black students in particular are much more likely to be enrolled in remedial courses, even though they're not required post AB 705. They are disproportionately ending up in those courses as a result of probably um, their own sense of whether they can handle college level, as well as other people's perception and the sort of the channeling of them through the placement processes. I think we need to look at implicit bias in instruction and in inequitable classroom practices like inequities in grading approaches, and faculty mindset issues like whether faculty hold a growth or a fixed mindset about their students, and whether they hold a deficit approach. Okay, now as promised, I'm going to talk a little bit about California's co-requisite models. And it's not as clean as like when, Peter Adams, first introduced the ALT model, and then CCRC was able to study the ALT model, and you could say, okay, the model has these features, and then these are the results. In California, it's just much more varied what is happening. So you can't do a kind of a clean evaluation of it, but I can tell you some of the broad parameters of co-requisite models. First, 1 in 5 students were enrolled in a co-requisite model statewide last year, which is not a lot. I mean, I think we have room to improve our results by expanding co-requisite enrollment. Of the 116 California community colleges, 101 offer co-requisite models in English, and 95 colleges do in math. And in math, the largest number of co-requisite models is co-requisite support with statistics, college statistics classes. That's 90 colleges have that. 58 colleges have a co-requisite model of pre-calculus / trig. 49 have college algebra, and 23 have applied calculus, and then there's smaller numbers of some other courses. In California, there's so much local control that is a lot of variability in how they're implemented. So some colleges require co-requisites. For example, my college requires it for students with below a 2.6 high school GPA. Some only recommend it. Some require it if you have a 1.9 GPA or lower. And then at other colleges, it's completely optional. The criteria for recommending or requiring are set locally. But most colleges are not using an ALT model where there's a sort of a mix of quote unquote college ready and underprepared. That it's most colleges just use a linked co-requisite model where they have the regular transferable gateway course, and then a linked co-req that's usually 1 to 2 units, and it has the same instructor, and it has a standard class size. So my college, our class size is 26 in English composition. So in my co-requisite supported model, I have 26 students, and they're all getting the co-requisite support, and only a handful use the ALT model. Our results are every college that is offering co-requisite model saw that co-requisite students completion was higher than students taking one remedial course over a year. And statewide, if you average it all together, co-requisite student completion is approximately 30 points higher in one term than students who started in a remedial class would complete in a year in English, or a year and a half in math. So it's like fall, spring, summer, and fall. And in that time, their completion rate was still more than 30 points lower than students who took a co-requisite model. And that was true in both, sort of math intensive STEM co-requisites, as well as statistics and liberal arts math co-requisites. And then finally, Black and Latinx students are equitably represented in completions in co-requisite models of English and statistics and liberal arts math. And so this suggests that increasing student enrollment in co-requisite support is a really promising strategy for continuing to chip away at those racial inequities. Okay, and then what works in co-requisite models? The Public Policy Institute of California interviewed English and math faculty at colleges with successful co-requisite models, and the faculty cited these elements that they had adopted from the professional development that we offer in the California Acceleration Project. So they said it was additional time with the instructor and classmates, the ability to provide just-in-time remediation for any foundational skills, collaborative classroom settings, relevant and rigorous curriculum, and attention to the affective domain. So things like fear and mindset and senses of belonging and community. And then several colleges with strong outcome, and particularly strong outcomes with Black students, also cited professional development in equity-minded instruction, including implicit bias, equitable grading, culturally sensitive teaching, and building relationships with students. Okay, and then before we go to our last round of questions, I want to say, here's my advice for other states. The first thing, based on our work in California, I would say is it's really important to change your placement paradigm away from determining ready or not ready, and instead to ensuring that students begin in the class where they have the greatest opportunity to complete a gateway course. And that to make that determination, you need to use quantitative data, not just faculty judgment. That's what's been really groundbreaking in our work in California, is that we've been able to look at this giant statewide data set of high school transcripts and community college transcripts and see, how are students with different, backgrounds and GPAs doing when they either take a remedial course or they take a transferable course directly. And that's what has shown us, wow, even the students with the lowest GPAs are still like 3 times better off enrolling directly in a transferable course. Their completion is 3 times higher if they just enroll directly without even any co-rec support than if they take a standalone remedial course. So that it's like the optimizing their chance of completion of the gateway course needs to be the paradigm, rather than just some arbitrary line you draw in the sand between ready and not ready. The next bit of advice for other states would be that the evidence is unequivocal that students have much higher completion when they begin in a gateway course with co-rec support if they need or want it. So we need to stop debating whether to make these changes and focus on how to do it well. And in this case, in California, having the legislation was really helpful, because those debates, which had been going on for 10 years and where the sides had gotten really hardened and people were just unwilling to budge, they were like, not going to do that. The legislation just bypassed that whole debate and was like, nope, we are going to do that. Now let's focus on doing it well. My next advice is abandon your placement tests. If the pandemic hasn't made you do that already, do it now. So that you should place all English and math students into gateway classes and use high school grades to identify those who would benefit from co-rec support. For example, English co-rec for students with a high school GPA below 2.6. And, for students who you really cannot get high school grade information from, then allow them to choose between those two models. I say there's a little asterisk there because, of course, students who are just learning the English language need separate classes. They need English language instruction, preferably in accelerated models. So I would exempt them, but that is a smaller group than you think, because our research in California shows that even if a student just attended 1 year of high school in the US and they're a language learner, but they graduated, they still were better off starting directly in college composition than starting in a below transfer ESL class. And then my last big piece of advice is that incremental voluntary approaches are good to mobilize faculty champions and build an evidence base for change. But large-scale transformation is unlikely without changes to state policy. So if you're in a state that values local control the way California does, and you maybe have a governing body that's more of a coordinating body that doesn't necessarily set policy, then I would really encourage people who are truly committed to students and committed to equity to start to pursue legislative change, because we realized in California that no matter how hard we were working, we were having diminishing returns on being able to really mobilize voluntary change. Meanwhile, the evidence was just becoming more and more solid that this is what would be best for students. So, okay, questions?
Katie, For
Yes.
sake of time, unfortunately, we don't have time for another round of questions, but I will say most of the questions that came into the chat, you were implicitly answering. So questions about outcomes or why are there still differences across different racial groups, you talked about directly during your presentation. For those, there was some questions specific to data. I would encourage those folks to go to accelerationproject.org. That is the website for the California Acceleration Project, where you can get details on the studies and the specific data. I want to just reiterate a comment that one person made when you were showing the student outcomes. It's a comment you made, which was, wow, we should just require it, meaning co-requisite, not make it optional. This is something that Complete College America is talking about, is this is settled. Co-requisite is the way to go. So we're going to go to our closing for sake of time, but I want to thank you, Katie. This has been amazing. For those of you who are on this, please come back in 2 weeks on March 25th. We're going to have another amazing presentation with Dr. Tristan Denley of the University System of Georgia. It's going to be at the same time. You could not ask for two better speakers on co-requisite than Dr. Katie Hearn and Dr. Tristan Denley. Please check out completecollege.org. You can create a profile, download our resources. If you have further questions, you can reach out to me at bprotis@completecollege.org. We will be following up with an evaluation and a recording of today's webinar, where you'll be able to view the slides again. There were some questions about that, and we will try to drop some resources in there as
And
well.
Brandon, can I say one more thing?
Please.
That if folks have a question, like there was a question about wanting to be directed to the English language data, you can email me at the California Acceleration Project at gmail.com, and we can send you more detailed links beyond the ones that we'll be sharing with
Katie, is
CCA.
that California spelled out, or is that CA?
It is California spelled out, and it's at the front of my PowerPoint. Is the address is on there.
And it was just dropped in the chat. Thank you, everyone who attended. We had a lot of interest in today's webinar, and we hope that it met your needs. Very powerful, convincing evidence and a vision for what co-requisite needs to look like. So thank you again.